is Andrea Richardson, and welcome to the Fresh Perspectives in Social Work podcast. Our topic today is a great one. Organizational development is a concept that has been around for a while in the business industry, but one that is fairly new when we're thinking about how to improve social service agencies' function. When we think about today's social service practice, agency leaders, supervisors, and frontline workers, we have to contend with a changing workforce, significantly more complex casework, funding streams that require layers of requirements and data, as well as public pressures from the community for more transparency and accountability. It can be challenging. What continues to be impressive are the number of social workers who continue to enter and remain in the field of work because they want better outcomes for children, youth, and families. So today we are blessed to have two amazing guests to help us introduce the concept of organizational development. This will be the first of many conversations, I would imagine, that we will help listeners understand not only how to think about their individual practices, but also the organizational change that can happen and have a broader impact on their communities and their workplace. My guests today are Jennifer Kerr, the Director of the Organizational Effectiveness Department at the American Public Human Services Association, otherwise known as APHSA. She has over 18 years of experience in organizational effectiveness consulting, curriculum development and training system design, and continuous quality improvement experience in supporting health and human service agencies across the country. Prior to APHSA, she began her career at the Philadelphia Department of Human Services and the University of Pittsburgh School of Social Work's Pennsylvania Child Welfare Resource Center. We are also joined by Megan Clough of BerryDunn. She is a senior consultant who supports clients by partnering to optimize organizational effectiveness through strategic use of organizational development tools, alignment, and practices. Megan partners with organizations to build and strengthen and improve their agency culture. She's a creative team leader who knows that when we intentionally create safe environments and honor and empower people to share their diverse, innovative ideas, we tap into a superpower. I just love that. That's just so awesome. So welcome, Jennifer and Megan.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're talking about organizational effectiveness, organizational development. I guess the first question I have is what is organizational development? And it's kind of like a word that I think people kind of use a bit in the industry now. How would you frame that?
So there's couple quick definitions. One is that it is kind of a planned and systematic approach, and its primary objective is improving the effectiveness of any organization, which is why you'll hear either organizational development, because an organization is developing toward improvements, or organizational effectiveness as another name, because it really is focused on how do we make our organizations optimally effective. It focuses primarily on aligning strategy and individuals and processes and building meaningful cultures around doing that sustain beyond any one individual or one administration, so that you'll see world-class organizations who focus on organizational development be able to sustain that culture, energy, and outcomes for years. So that there are four primary focus areas that we typically see. One of them is determining direction. Where are we going as an organization? Another is, what is the structural design of the organization? Because structural design can impact how work is conducted every day. And then talent development, we all are blessed to have incredible people in our organizations. And how do we unlock that potential, facilitate it, and clear the runway so that they are able to do their jobs most effectively? Mm-hmm. And I would say last but not least is operational improvement. How do we stay attuned to things that become, I had a prior leader say, pebbles in our shoes? In other words, they block or mitigate our ability to make progress. So that's really organizational development and effectiveness. So
Yeah.
it's got a history, and I know, I know we can talk about that too. Jennifer, I want to certainly give you the chance to jump in.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Great, Megan. And I think some key things that you shared, definitely to kind of reinforce is when I think about organizational development, I think about it systemically and systematically. And so just as you kind of shared that importance from that system perspective, and I think the other thing that really is top of mind for me when I think about organizational development is what drives change in an organization's culture. And one of the things I know that I'm sure we'll get into today as we talk is around how do we drive change, thinking from the perspective of the whole employee, right? And so it's bigger than training, it's bigger than consulting, and it's bigger than coaching. And so how do all of those kind of fit together as an avenue?
Yeah, and I'm glad that you mentioned that, Jen, because I know that sometimes, when people are seeing things that are happening in their organization, they're like, oh, everyone just needs to go to a training for this, like that's going to be the ultimate fix. But I think what I'm hearing from both of you is really it's something bigger than that. And training is maybe one piece after you kind of look at what's going on, but that it can be, other things might be a better path. And a better use of your time to kind of make the change happen.
Yeah, and Andrea, it's funny that you said that because, when I thought about kind of how did I become interested in the work of organizational development, it's exactly that. So I started in training, and it was very soon thereafter that I learned that training is not a quick fix. Yeah. Training does not fix, in air quotes, I like to say, an organization. And I recognize that super quickly around the importance and support of organizational development as a whole piece when you're driving change.
Yeah. And Megan, how did you get involved in this type of work?
Well, my parents would tell you that it started exceedingly early because I came running down when I was about 13 years old with a quote that I found, and I asked permission to read the quote because it has swear word in our family. And I said, well, what's the quote? They said, and I said, well, it's essentially the hottest places in hell should be reserved for those people who in times of crisis do nothing at all. And this was when I was 13 years old. So they said, well, clearly we're focused on social advocacy and improving situations. And then I started to follow that up in undergraduate degree of cultural anthropology. And probably the most pivotal moment was in understanding that cultures are socially created. In other words, we create them by virtue of tools, resources, attitudes, values, approaches. And once we realize that they can be socially created or renovated at any given time, it brings forth this sense of empowerment for, gosh, we can improve what is around us at any given moment and ensure that our agencies and our organizations are achieving their goals at maximum impact. And so that's what really started. I've worked both as a consultant and in organizations, and the derivation of my involvement started as early as that.
Yeah. And it sounds like that, that kind of experience is probably stuff that you see, Jen, in your work with APHSA and working with a lot of state human service agencies, or, that kind of aspect of, the climate, the culture of the agency, as well as sort of your just average, practices and functions are probably things that are probably things that you see quite often in your work.
Absolutely, are things that we always see. And so really recognizing how culture is so embedded into the work. And one of the kind of theories that I always use is culture eats strategy. So if your organization doesn't have a culture that encourages change, encourages continuous improvement, it doesn't matter which strategic, priority areas that you have, because you're not going to be able to get there.
So it sounds like from just if we kind of think about this as, if I'm seeing some of these culture things that are happening or my organization isn't quite working quite right, or even as an individual, I'm looking for some improvement. What kinds of things, we did talk about sort of that openness to kind of broader thinking and looking at culture, but what are some of the other skills, or I guess we call them competencies sometimes? What are some of those things that you might want to have in place or kind of consider as you're thinking like, hey, is this something I want to sort of dive into?
So I love what Jennifer just said in terms of that quote, and it reminds me of another one that she'll know as well, I guarantee, which is if you take a motivated individual and put them up against a problematic system, the system will win every time. Mm-hmm. And so when you are asking then about skills, I guess I would name probably 5 or 6. One is understanding images of organizations. So how can you examine organizations in a way that helps you consider how they're designed, what levers there are within an organization to facilitate and drive change, as Jen was saying. Mm-hmm. And so knowing the tools available then would be a second one within organizational structures that can be leveraged for creating effective cultures, and then knowing how to use them healthily. That's really important, because to be clear, these tools can do good and they can also do damage. They're typically not neutral. And so it's really important. I had a blessing in my career to become familiar with something called the chain reaction of excellence. And it was based on research of how world-class organizations standardly organize their priorities. And so for me, that's another one. It's a very learnable tool. So it's less about having, an innate skill or ability, and more about, listen, if you could become familiar with that. In terms of the skills, I think we absolutely need to be able to observe. So we have to monitor, view, listen, and analyze on a regular, ongoing basis. Just imagine that Jen and I in our work are on reconnaissance mode all the time. We can't help it. It's built in. And we know, as we think about, today's group who are likely listening, social workers, administrators within agencies, they are as well. So we know that this skill is well inherent within the audience for today's podcast. And then I think also influencing skills.
Yes.
Because we're influencing change. And as we all know, we don't have control really over anything other than ourselves. So how can we influence? And I think I'll stop at one more, which is knowing and choosing daring behaviors versus self-protection behaviors. And ultimately knowing that it's not, our actions are important. The end goal is about the organization. If you're self-centered as an organizational development leader, that's not going to work. You have to be organizational centered. Organizationally centered, I guess would be accurate. So those are what I look for.
Yeah, and I think, Megan, agree with all of them. There's just a few from, in my experience that I think also is super helpful. And just expanding a little bit, you talked about, you mentioned observing skills. You talked about listening as part of one of those skills. And for me, that listening piece really is listening to understand versus listening to respond, right? And so as a facilitator, I want to step back versus step up of organizational development and organizational change. Another key kind of skill that I think about all the time is flexibility, and being flexible to meet the group or the team or staff, whoever you're working with, each day where they are, right? And the ability to throw all your plans out the door, because they may not be in that place, to kind of move work forward that day that way. And I think some of the others is the recognition of time. So as a organizational development or effectiveness facilitator, being able to understand and respect that change takes time. Change is not a quick win, but then also being able to communicate with organizational sponsors or leadership that change take time, we will be identifying, quick wins throughout. But if you're looking for something, your whole organization and system to look differently or feel differently in a month, change management is not the, thing or resource to kind of utilize.
And we chuckle a little bit, Jen, but I think we all can think of organizations that we've worked with that have wanted that change to happen yesterday. But you're right that those are things that do take time because people have to kind of buy into it. They have to be educated around it. All of these pieces that you both have talked about are just so important to even being ready. Right? Being ready to kind of get into this change. So, if you are, coming in and working with folks, what are some things that you kind of think about or look at, that would help you know, is this person or is this organization ready, for this type of work? Are there things that you kind of, look at?
Yeah, I guess, to start us off, I look, if I'm looking at a group of supervisors or even staff, I'm looking at their desire and belief, that staff at all levels and community members can drive and innovate change. That it doesn't have to come from the top down. And they're displaying these skills kind of in not only what they do, but what they say and how they model or demonstrate these behaviors. And so that belief in staff belief in self is definitely key and critical. And then as a supervisor, as a leader, individually, again, I shared a little bit earlier, but stepping back so others can step up and not knowing what's next. And being okay with those pieces. And so the demonstration of them, the being verbal about that, asking those questions and observing those behaviors are definitely some of the things that I look for at the individual level for readiness for change.
So it sounds like if I'm hearing you correctly, if you're someone who likes certainty in like what you do, this might feel a little uncomfortable.
Yes.
Because it's not, it just doesn't work that way. It's not black and white like that.
A plus B does not equal C.
Right. Exactly. But I would imagine that, for those of us who are in the social work field, that these are things that you can kind of tune into yourself and you can, use those good social work skills to kind of help you get ready and be okay, and kind of recognize kind of those feelings that you might be having as this kind of change is maybe happening around you or you're deciding to kind of make some changes in the work that you do.
Absolutely.
Megan, did you have some things to add too?
I do. I think you both make super points, no surprise. And to anchor what you're, I think for that sense of uncertainty that is somewhat built into driving organizational change. One of the beautiful things about organizational development is that we can create, by virtue of the actions that we're taking, some sense of clarity and milestone actions that are quite sure. So, for instance, one of the things that I think shows readiness is when someone recognizes an issue. So if someone notices an issue and is really interested in making a difference around that issue, then even in moments of notable change, we can refer back to that issue. Okay, we're making progress on that, and so it rallies people around the primary cause that they're trying to seek. So I think both recognizing the issue is something that shows readiness when someone recognizes it, and then recognizing the issue or pointing them back to the issue at certain milestones during the work can help create that stability. And I would also say, because Jennifer and I know that this type of work, it can take months. It can take years, depending on the scope of the change. So, and there are milestones along the way. So that ability to zoom up and out and look backwards and notice and observe progress is important and is something that creates stability. And then I think the other piece, just relative to personal readiness, and that speaks to that uncertainty you're describing, is they don't need to know OD terms. You don't need to, there's, it can be a little overwhelming when you're hearing, these terms and you think, I don't know idea what that means. So you don't need to know the terms. You really just need to kind of either formally or intuitively understand that there is a human relations connection to organizational success, just like there's a human relations connection to creating success with families and with children. So that human relations connection, again, I think agencies focused in this area are in better shape than many to really understand the nature of organizational development. So it's very exciting. So that's what I would offer.
Yeah. And so I wonder if we're thinking about organizations and kind of their readiness to do the work, and you're talking about how, like, as an organization, it's like its own big family kind of thing, right? What kinds of things do you need to have, like, do your leaders need to be on the same page, or, like, what does it look like? Who do you have to have at the table to kind of help move this forward in a good, healthy way?
So when I think about that organizational readiness, I think about 4 kind of sub-focus areas, and I'll just share a little bit about each. I do think about, when I think about change readiness, I should say, for an organization, I look at those 4 things. And so one really is around the organizational readiness itself. And so I'm going to look at the history, right? And so how many start and stops did they have? Is that more of a culture versus continuous improvement and driving some of those changes? I'm going to want to know a little bit more around the climate or culture of that organization today. And how it got to where it is, and then really thinking about the clarity of roles and responsibilities within the organization. Are people clear? Is it an organization that is very siloed in kind of their customer service, or is it kind of blended and supported, but with clear roles and responsibilities? I'm also going to look at the readiness of the actual leadership team or sponsorship team for this work. And I'm going to look at what is the expectations of the leadership team to the staff. And to the community, to their stakeholders, to their partners. I'm going to look at how they respond to challenges or setbacks. Are they thinking that, challenges can be learning opportunities, or this is something we have to tackle or overcome, right now? The time, again, that they allow for continuous improvement within their organization, the recognition of the importance of continuous improvement. And then the final 2 things for leadership I'm going to think about is decision making and how decisions are made, who they're made with, not for, within an organization, and then honestly the stability of the leadership team. Right. And so we've all been around and have had to work with and support leadership teams that sometimes I hear people say that this is their 6th leader in 7 years. Right. And so that momentum for change and kind of pulling those pieces forward. When I think about staff readiness, again, earlier I thought about the leadership expectations of staff. So now what are staff's expectations of the organization? What are buy-ins? What are those expectations for systems improvement? I'm looking for teamwork again. Do staff want to, and are they created opportunities to work together to drive changes and support? And then the final piece is that general capacity. Is the organizational strategy clear? Is communication bi-directional, every which way that needs to happen? How is data used? for impact and decision making within an organization, and then the use of what I call strategic support functions. So recognizing the importance of human resources, of IT, of fiscal, of all staff within the organization. So they're just kind of those 4 areas that are important to me.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting, Jen, because I think that some of what you're talking about, I feel like it's like, man, you're like a detective or trying to solve like a puzzle, right? So you're looking at all of these different things and trying to kind of piece together how things fit, what maybe doesn't fit so great. And I really like the idea of, looking at the history of the organization, like kind of like, why do they do what they do? And where have they done something that has really, been sort of that change progress? That you can almost like draw some attention to, because sometimes when agencies are coming to us, they might say like, oh, everything, that the sky is falling and everything is going horribly wrong. But that there usually is some pieces that you can kind of pull out that says, hey, no, there's some things that were going well, that you are, doing well. And let's leverage some of those pieces. And this is kind of why you're doing what you're doing, because you've had this history or these pieces, these things in place. So that's really great. Megan, did you have something to add?
I think everything that's been stated is super.
Okay.
And I would mention only one thing and supplement, which is really, we can go into it later too, I think, is there is kind of a research and around and an art to how do you maximize social change. So, how do you create the social network environment within your organization? And Jen spoke a little bit to this relative to roles and responsibilities and communication. So it's that combination of how do you maximize what research tells us about social networking change to really, really make change and do it in a meaningful and effective way. And it has everything to do with not only the structure, also the pace and how much people are imbibing at any one time. So I think I think that was captured really in the scope of everything that you and Jen have already said. So one thing you'll always note about OD individuals, people who are trained in this field, is if something has been said and already said beautifully, we're good. Like we don't need to say it again. So I'm just going to pause. So
absolutely. So when we're thinking about kind of, and I know we've talked a lot about change, but I always think to like the human side of change and kind of the effects that some of your work might have on people, making them maybe slightly nervous about like, oh, what's coming down the pike? Do I have my job? Is my job going to change? Like if what I'm comfortable in, is it going to be different? So what kinds of things do you do or have done or kind of view when you're thinking about engaging and kind of making people feel maybe not totally comfortable, but okay with sort of the next steps of what's going to happen?
Well, I think honoring, first of all, what you'd said, that uncertainty is the most uncomfortable human condition. Yes. And so, most of us don't get up in the morning, except OD people, I will say, and say, woo, let's go do some change. Like most of us are not thinking that this is our day to change again. And so part of it actually is to start to reframe change as something that really does help develop, progress, advance, because our natural human instinct shoots us into fight or flight and says, uncertain equals, I don't get that. I don't recognize it. I'm not familiar, comfortable, or trusting of that. Avoid, right? And so how can we acknowledge that is human nature? And then how can we essentially help our own human nature begin to focus more on a continuous aspect of change, which, if you think about it, if it's continuous, then it becomes familiar, comfortable, and the notion that we'll just continually do it. So that's one. And then I think the other is really around this social networking. And there's a gentleman named Damon Centola who's written a book on change. It talks about the research, sociology research around how change unfolds in communities and countries and organizations, and acknowledges that really even major complex social change that can sometimes appear like it occurred very abruptly actually typically has kind of a tailwind, right? An earlier history, depending on the volume of the change, of, many months or many years. And that tailwind is built out of connectivity among people through complex organizational change through meaningful connections. And ideally what you do is you create what's kind of called the closed loop. In other words, within your organization, you have reiterated messages. Reiterate the message over and over, and reiterate the message so that it provides clarity by person and by role. People want to know what is in this or not in this for me, and what is in this and not in this for my department, and what is in this or not in this for those who I serve and the organization as a whole. So you have to take these kind of large researched models or theories and then make them pragmatically very tangible. And I think that's the key. And that's something that Jennifer and I do, and I know you do too, Andrea, in our everyday work, is we're constantly staying attuned to organizational research around what is effective. And then we're thinking about how do we take that and make it very, very practical.
Sure.
Yeah.
So,
and agreeing, Megan, everything definitely that you're sharing, and especially around kind of the theory and learning, and it's this continuous journey for us too, as organizational development professionals. And I think I would add just two pieces. The one kind of is my foundation as actually someone that is more introvert than extrovert, is quietness does not equal lack of engagement. So some people need to reflect. Some people need to kind of understand and process. And as Megan shared, change is unstable. People view it as instability. And so how do we kind of move that forward? And then one of the things I do, recognizing that, is having or making time and room for periodic check-ins and multiple ways, right? So you're checking in with the group as an organizational development facilitator after each session. But then I'm also setting some time for individual check-ins with participants, not just with kind of the project oversight or managers, but participants in the change, checking in with them. Are they okay? What can you do as a facilitator to help drive their support of this change differently, better throughout the process?
Yeah. And I think that we've sort of hinted on pieces of this as we've kind of had this conversation today. But what, if I were to take a snapshot or a short movie of what success might look like, right? Like what would be some things I might see just from your experience, both of you working with, a wide variety of organizations, what are some things that you kind of see that would say, okay, this change is kind of moving in a good direction and my organization is healthier and, the culture is better? What kinds of things might I notice?
So I think one, it's such a super question. So I think one, especially if it's a newly announced change, something, brand new or reinitiated, is that people start talking about it. And this actually can make people very nervous, especially leadership. And so, especially if, and this is fascinating. So especially if the viewpoints that are discussed around an issue are polarized and the conversation is happening within the organization. So I have some really good news, and I know Jen knows this too, is that when that happens, that polarization within an organization, as long as it is supported by kind of facilitated listening and conversation and support, teams will start to, without even necessarily recognizing it first, come together to find what that resolution is. And the nervousness when people start talking about the change. On the one hand, people are excited because you're thinking, whoa, all right, we announced it, and then they're talking about it. Then, when they're talking about it, if there's this opposition within the conversation, all of a sudden there can be this nervousness and on the behalf of leadership saying, should we stop now before we get too far? And so, and I guess that's as well where I would say that another sign for organizational progress is when leadership decides to wisely stay the course. And I'm not necessarily saying stay the course on the specific strategies, because as Jennifer said earlier, we have to remain very flexible. And as you had said earlier, Andrea, you used the analogy of a puzzle. I often use that in combination with a chessboard. So there can be times when we read cues and we're like, okie dokie. So that methodology, that specific method we were going to try, we're hearing loud and clear that's probably not the way to go. And they're giving us evidence as to why. When we listen to what people are describing there and we honor that and adjust flexibly, that generates and reinforces that we are listening and engaging collectively together in this change. And so those are both a combination of actions that we can take and cues that we are making progress. And the other thing I'll say, and I bet this is going to be the perfect introduction to Jennifer, is measure, 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 measure. All right, Jennifer, you're up.
And how do I measure, right? And so when I think about that as an organizational development professional, I'm measuring it kind of from two main ways. I'm looking at it from the perspective of people. So how staff, how community members, how stakeholders see themselves as part of the change. Can they feel that they fit? Do they see their part in driving, supporting those change? And then kind of as Megan shared too, some of the other observational piece, as an organizational development professional, looking to measure change by also the capacity I've built with those that I've worked with. Can they continue the conversations? Are they doing more asking and reflecting versus telling, just in their everyday? And so have I modeled or demonstrated how to have a conversation, how to understand the why? Versus always the what. And so there are some of the things that I look and kind of measure along the way as well. And then again, looping back to what I had shared just previously, is some of that can be through periodic check-ins too.
Sure. Megan?
Andrea, can I build on that? Okay, thank you. I was like, can I build on that? Because it's, again, so excited about what's happening here. So so building on what you said, Jen, about that conversation, that modeling, here's some really great news that has been repeatedly researched is, and you had said earlier, Jen, too, making sure not only to connect with leadership, also out and throughout the organization. So the great news is that the origin story for all notable and successful social change in our organizations is the periphery. That's really important to know. It's the periphery. And so we have to outreach to that periphery. Now, here's the other bonus. There is truly a research proven number, a percentage of people that if you can get that number of people kind of on board, engaged, and clustered around the periphery, It's the tipping point. And that tipping point actually is what will drive the change. So often leadership, formal leadership within an organization will think that that weight is all on them. When in fact, their involvement is critical for getting the story started and allowing for the conversations and the inclusion. But 25%, that's the fraction of people that really need to be engaged and on board with the idea or actions that will motivate that tipping point. And what's interesting, it's not 24%. It's not 24.5%. It is 25%. And it's really very, very interesting research. So focus on that volume, but focus intentionally on where that volume is focused as well.
Right. And when you're thinking of like organizations that, are even, kind of big, or that fraction of a quarter of the people really is not as big as you think. So it's really great. I want to I could talk about this for hours. I really could. What I'm excited is that we will be back for our second episode. Yes. But I do want to thank Jennifer and Megan for starting our conversation on the concept of organizational development, readiness for change, and how to measure success. If you thought this was great, you be sure to join us next week as we take a deeper look into moving this forward from theory to practice. And as you won't want to miss all of the resources and the examples, because both of these ladies have a ton of experience and can tell you stories that really just resonate with everyone's work that they're doing. So subscribe to our podcast, share with your colleagues and friends, and take care.